watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. From Toronto, Ontario, I'm Catherine Bullock. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. Today, a conversation with a political strategist, Richard Landau, about Canada, Ukraine and the Russian crisis. First, some news headlines. Feds to remove PCR antigen tests from border entry requirements. Canadian Muslims worried for their daughters after hijab ban confirmed in Indian courts. First generation Egyptian Canadian to release stand-up comedy album. Ukrainians display 109 strollers to remember children killed in war. And now the details. Mandatory COVID testing before entering the country will be scrapped as of April 1st for fully vaccinated travellers, announced the federal government Thursday. Select travellers will still be randomly selected to conduct an arrival test. Unvaccinated foreigners will rarely be admitted. Partially or unvaccinated Canadians will have to do a molecular test upon arrival and another one 8 days later. The measures are part of an early effort to return to pre-COVID travel conditions. Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos said that a high vaccination rate and manageable COVID count makes these changes possible. Canadian Muslims are angry and worried about India's hijab ban and its impact on their relatives and their daughters if they go home to visit. Tasneem Vali says her son could walk around unhindered, but her daughters might be attacked because they wear hijab, according to local media sources. Lubna Hussain, who grew up in Hyderabad before moving to Manitoba, told local media sources she was angry that a woman's dress choice was still up for public discussion and dispute in 2022. The hijab ban on Muslim students was reinforced in Karnataka, India's High Court Tuesday. An estimated 200 million Muslims live in India. Egyptian-Canadian comedian Salma Hindi will release her first comedy album on March 25th. The album, called Born on 9/11, features 13 tracks and was recorded live in Toronto, Ontario. Hindi invites the audience to learn more about Muslim culture, family, and her lived experiences. She shares personal stories about growing up as a Muslim born on September 11, her overprotective parents, and her experiences with Halloween. Hindi, a first-generation immigrant, holds a master's in engineering and also graduated from the stand-up comedy program at the Second City Training Centre in Toronto. A total of 109 strollers were lined up in central Lviv yesterday, representing the number of children killed in Ukraine due to Russian attacks. The display comes hours after a Ukrainian state news channel reported 109 children were killed and another 130 children were wounded in the war, which is now entering its fourth week. Russian forces have been criticized for targeting vulnerable populations, including children, pregnant women, and medical health professionals in multiple attacks. James Elder, a United Nations Children's Fund spokesman, said that 55 Ukrainian children become refugees every minute. And that's it for the news. The Russians and the Ukrainians are negotiating an end to the war, while the Russian offensive continues. To talk about Canada's role and other matters, we have with us political strategist Richard Landau. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
We know that outside of Ukraine, Canada has the highest percentage of Canadian population, the diaspora. So this war is obviously hitting home and traumatic for a lot of people here in Canada. Are you satisfied with the Canadian response so far?
You know, there's not a lot we can do short of starting a war, any of us outside of the actual direct conflict. I really think the time to have done other different things was years ago. For example, in 1989, when the Iron Curtain began to come down and the Soviet bloc broke up, there may have been much, much more to have been done then. Certainly around the future role of NATO. What would NATO become? And we didn't do that work back then. So I think in some sense, we're harvesting some of that now.
I think if I remember, I heard Noam Chomsky suggesting that Gorbachev, when that was happening, had wanted to have sort of like a bigger pan-European bloc, and that was rejected. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yes, exactly, because NATO was defined coming out of the war. It was defined as basically the organization of European nations that would resist the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet bloc.
Mm.
And I guess also part of its goal was to make sure we didn't have yet a third world war originated by Germany. I mean, that's a secondary role. The primary role was to oppose the Warsaw Pact. So when the Warsaw Pact fell apart, it would have been, why not offer membership to all of them, including Russia? Because the United Nations, now I'm dreaming here for a second, the United Nations doesn't have a strong peacemaking army or force. And NATO could have done that. NATO is something like, for those of you who like science fiction, like Starfleet is to the Federation of Planets. NATO could have become the military arm of the UN, and it could have included Russia.
I have never quite understood why Russia is seen as a natural enemy of the United States or the West.
I agree. I mean, the old Soviet thing, when it disappeared in 1989, had we in the West, and particularly the Americans, moved very quickly to bind those wounds, to heal those wounds, to cauterize them and say, you know what? We're not enemies anymore. Let us work together and form a union together. But I suppose there must be someone who's taking advantage of the fact that the Russia is always seen as the opponent. Now, for a number of years, relations had become somewhat cordial or warmer, but Russia was never engaged in, or brought into this group of nations.
Right. In around the First World War time in Canada, Ukrainian Canadians and Turkish Canadians were interned in camps. Now, there's not a lot of documentation about the Turkish experience. There's been quite much more done about the Ukrainian experience. They finally got an apology from the Canadian government in 2008. It took decades. And they faced a lot of discrimination. They weren't considered European. They weren't considered from a civilized race. And I was struck by this when I heard Chrystia Freeland, our Deputy Prime Minister, on, I think it was a radio interview. She said something like, Canada must respond strongly, and not because I have Ukrainian heritage, but because it's the right thing to do. And I was struck by her need to kind of say this, like, we're doing this, but it's not because I have Ukrainian background. Do you think that that was an unusual thing? If it had been, I don't know, Russia invading Britain, would British heritage politicians have to say, it's not because of my British heritage?
No, it's true. I mean, there's bias built into the system. Clearly there is. And you just have to watch a newscast. I remember when the DRC, Zaire, the Democratic Republic of Congo, there were 400,000 people a year being murdered there. Barely made the news here. Barely made the news. Why? Well, I think I know why. But that's the unfortunate aspect of both our news media and our public agenda. If they look like us, if they sound like us, we immediately, our hearts go out to them. Otherwise, I'm not saying we don't ever respond. I do recall the response to Biafra in Nigeria. I remember the response to Bangladesh. But typically, we're slower to respond, and I can't deny that. And I can also look at the media coverage, because part of what I do is I look at media analysis. And if they look like us and sound like us, then we might respond more quickly and more favorably.
I think that's a bit of a natural. I mean, I think that's a bit of human nature. It's sort of a bit natural because you feel drawn to what you're like. But the point would be then to be self-aware and to mitigate against that. But you've raised a very important point that international commentators have been noticing with this particular tragedy in Ukraine, the refugees being welcomed into open arms around Europe, whereas let's see, in Bulgaria, in Poland, they had put up barbed wire fences to make sure the Syrians didn't come in. Bulgaria has said these are intelligent and educated refugees, so we welcome them. They had a new a law just passed, not a law, in the EU, they made an agreement to skip the asylum process and give the Ukrainian refugees 3 years residency, whereas the Syrians were, camping outside barbed wire. Can you just share a little bit of your insight about this?
Well, again, it's a matter of, you think differently, you believe differently, your behavior patterns may be a little different. And that's where leadership needs to step up and say, hey, they're human beings. We can't stand by and watch another human being be persecuted and die. And so it's sometimes much easier to just park it. I mean, I can think of situations in Africa, many, for example, where we have not responded, and we've not responded in the same way. Ukrainians also, I have to say, to be fair, have a history in Canada, a long history of contributing. In spite of being interned in World War I, we've had a Ukrainian origin governor general, at least one. That was Raymond Natishin. And when you travel across the prairies, Ukrainians have made and do make a significant contribution. So in that sense, Ukrainians are interwoven with Canadians in ways that others may not be. That's not to say we don't respond out of humanity. We should respond equally to all those who suffer.
So perhaps there should have been a commitment to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
I think also because in this particular case, there's no confusion about who's the aggressor here. That makes it easier for us to respond. It's clear at least to me, it's clear, no matter how you want to paint it, that Russia was the first mover in this, with the aggressor. And so it's very easy to take the side of someone who is very clearly the underdog, is very clearly the one being preyed upon, whose borders have been broken. So that's very black and white and cut and dried, and the media can very easily frame it for you. So that's part of what takes place. And I think it's worth noting that I think people should be taking note of how we respond to Ukraine. And unfortunately, such circumstances are likely to occur again around the planet. And I would call upon the nation to take the same approach. However, I have to say, you remember perhaps when the Ismaili community was being persecuted in Uganda by Idi Amin. It was Pierre Trudeau and his government that took them in to Canada. So we don't, they certainly appearing to be other people. We were very quick and they've been obviously a wonderful community within Canada. So I don't think you can make a blanket rule, but I think some cases are easier to make than others. And like we thought Idi Amin was crazy, just like many of us feel that way about Putin. So it's easier to, I suppose, identify with the victims.
It is very, very complicated. But then the double standard comes back because, Israel's been confiscating Palestinian land and bulldozing homes while giving a family like an hour to get out. And yet the natural sympathy to the underdog doesn't seem to be there in that case.
There's another a very complex situation. And I would say that it's far be it from me to apply a uniform solution. But I think if the two sides there could acknowledge each other's existence and right to exist, that's as simple as it gets. Then the rest of us might not have to deal with it the way we've been dealing with it. And that's not a deep answer. But no. It's clearly what needs to take place is there needs to be a recognition of each other's right to exist. And I got to tell you something, whether it's military forces invading or it's people chucking bombs into other people's communities, all of it, it's just irritant. It's constant.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but we hope we can have you back another day for your insights. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
You've been watching Canadian Muslim News. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay safe and God bless.